All right, welcome everyone. My name is Ciro Continisio. I want to start on time because I have a lot of stuff to cover. I want to give a little heads up. This talk is not about nested prefabs, so just so you know. No, don't move, don't move. I mean, that is not about just nested prefab. It's about much, much more. So brace yourselves. So it is about what we call the new prefab workflow, so the improvements to this workflow, which includes many, many things. But first, I want to give you some small introduction on the methodology that was used to get to this final point, because, of course, this thing was started like a couple of years ago, and then 1 year ago, the project was like rekindled with a new team. There was a product manager, Stine Kierbo, and she started doing all these things. She started surveys at the past Unite Europe. She started doing interviews and showing some first prototypes that were made by the team that I see at the back of the room. And this was a user-centered development. So the idea here is that we couldn't just make nested prefabs. Even though that was what people were asking for, we couldn't just make nested prefabs and that was it, because that was kind of easy in some way. But through these surveys and interviews, and then private demos, and then once the first prototypes were ready, we started doing usability tests. And we even did a couple of game jams inviting external guests. Some goals and guiding principles emerged. So we saw that it wasn't just nested prefabs that people wanted, but it was much more. One of them was flexibility, of course. Nested prefab, that's the core of it, right? You have a prefab that can go inside another prefab. So the prefab is flexible. It covers many, many areas. People wanted collaboration. So the idea that there's not a huge prefab that everybody's touching, but everybody's touching smaller prefabs, and then there's no conflicts. So for bigger teams, that was key. What you see is what you get. The solution that some people used was to instantiate prefabs into prefabs at runtime. If you ever tried to make nested prefabs, maybe you tried this, some of you. And that's not the best, because you only see things when you press play. So we wanted a solution that provided you what you see is what you get kind of experience. This is in edit mode. It's going to be the same in play mode. And because we had these new things, and also because of nested prefabs, they introduce more complexity, we had to reduce cognitive load. So strip away some things, actually, to give you more focus on what you're doing. And for this, I like to use a quote from the project manager of the team, product manager, sorry. Stine, she says, it has to be safe to be messy, and it has to be easy to be organized. I like this sentence. Usability, because, again, this system has much more power, usability and efficiency. We need to make everything leaner. We need to reduce clicks, actually. So even the act of pressing apply, now you don't need to do it anymore, because that will lead to a lot of clicks when you're dealing with a lot of prefabs. And then one of the main guiding principles is safety. So everything is built around the concept that we want you to make as less mistakes as possible. And with this in mind, I want to start by demoing prefab mode. So you might have seen the keynote yesterday. Who has seen the keynote? Nobody? Okay, some people. And you've probably seen prefab mode. Prefab mode is the idea that here I have a scene, and I have this prefab of the ship, and I want to make some changes to this prefab. But I don't want to make them in the scene. I want to make them into what is called prefab mode. So the first thing I want to point you to is that now in the hierarchy, objects have icons. So this is obviously a game object, this is a prefab, and this comes with the idea that with nested prefabs there's more complexity. So you can actually have a prefab that has a game object nested inside, but then you can have somewhere, I don't know actually where, some prefabs that have some other prefabs nested inside. So the icons now give you a clearer overview of what's a prefab, what's a game object, and what's a variant, and we're going to see variants later. So this dropship, I want to make some changes to this dropship. As you can see, the whole hierarchy is available like before, but what I don't want to do is I want to make changes here. The old workflow would be to select this dropship, make some changes, and hit apply, right? But we want you to move away from this workflow, from this mindset, if you want. It's a small favor that we're asking, but in time it's going to make your productivity much, much better. So instead of making my changes here, I'm going to go into prefab mode, and I can do it in several ways. I can do it by clicking on this little triangular icon, or if I have the prefab selected here in the project, for example, I can also do it. So I'm going to do it like this. I click on the icon, and I'm in prefab mode. And prefab mode is a kind of isolated view of what the prefab contains. So you see now I'm looking at the prefab in this background that you can actually choose the color of to make it more evident. And here on the left, in the hierarchy, I see all the objects that make this prefab. And the hierarchy is also automatically exploded, so you can see everything at once. And you can have a clear overview. And now I can make my changes here. And you will notice this little icon here, autosave. As long as autosave is on, every change is going to be saved automatically directly to the prefab. So there's no apply button. Well, there is an apply button, but there's no concept of using apply compulsively in prefab mode. You make your changes like this. You select something. For example, I'm going to select these particles. I'm going to enable them and play the system. Whoops. And so I see the particles playing in here. And as long as autosave is on, all the changes are going to be saved in the scene. And so once I go back to the dropship, you see if I go back in and I select this object, they're still active. So if I go back into the scene and I have the objects here, they have been, I think, overridden. let me drop the dropship again into the scene. So you can see that the particles are playing. So the idea is that you want to make your changes, as I said before, not in the scene. If the changes are permanent, if the changes are something that you want to send to the prefab, you don't want to make them in the scene. You want to go into prefab mode, make your changes, and you make your changes, they're automatically saved, go back, and you're safe, right? And because this leads me to the other small little change that the team has made, which is the overrides. So when you're dealing with prefabs in a scene, you might have some overrides. And in the past, when you had overrides on a prefab and you didn't know about them, you would propagate those overrides to the prefab and screw everybody's work, basically. We want to avoid that as well. So for example, Helen here, she has this object, which is these swirls of the attacks that she does, that should be off, right? So I want to disable them and save it to the prefab. But if you notice, she has some overrides here. And now overrides are visualized, apart from being bold, they are also highlighted by this thin blue line. So you have a clear visualization of what overrides are there. But not only that, sorry, I shouldn't unzoom. You have this drop-down here now. So instead of just the apply button, overrides are hidden behind this drop-down. So you can now open this and see clearly all the overrides that are on this object, on this instance. So I'm seeing here that this instance of the prefab Helen in the scene has these overrides. And if I click, I see this thing which is called comparison view. And comparison view shows you the overrides side by side. So here, the static flag has been, it's the same, but it has been touched, right? It could have been like this. And so that way, you can see that this instance is static, but the source prefab was not. And here you're able to also revert and apply the changes. So you have several levels of detail. Once you open the override dropdown, you have revert all and apply all, which are going to revert or apply all the overrides on this object. Then you have the single layers, right? The game object or its components, and you can apply and revert on that level. Or you have a third option. You right-click on each override, and you apply or revert the single ones. So this gives you a lot of control on what you want to apply or revert, and the override drop-down gives you a lot of visibility on what's happening on that prefab. And again, because I don't know who has touched this prefab, maybe Mattia has done that, my level designer. So I don't know if he's changed something. And I don't know if he wants to actually keep these changes. Then I go into prefab mode, I select the trail effect, I disable it, go out, and of course, it didn't save. Did I disable the wrong stuff? Well, let's force a save. Yeah, let's do the trick again. Sorry. No, this is the prefab model. Don't laugh. I said don't laugh. So now the object has the trails disabled. This is why this is coming in 0.3, by the way. It's not coming now. But you get the concept, right? This gives you more visibility on what's happening on any instance of a prefab, and then you temporarily step in the prefab, you make your changes, and you close that environment, and you show that the changes you made are not distracting everybody's workflow. So this is for overrides and prefab mode. Then we have nesting. So I purposely call these nesting prefabs and not nested prefabs, because the idea is that there is no such a concept as a prefab that's always nested, right? There's not a nested prefab. But a prefab can be nested into something else. So, for instance, I have here a bunch of rocks that I'm using to cover these cuts in the environment. So you see here these two pieces of environment, they're cutting through each other. So I use this pile of rocks just to cover them. And so what I'm doing here is that basically I have prefab nested into each other. So these rocks are coming from a more atomic rock prefab that I have just nested into this thing that I call small rocks line. And as you can see, I can step, I have this prefab inside, and now you see the icon is helping me understanding that this is actually a prefab, and I can step into that prefab as well, and now I'm actually at the base level. And this is showing me that this prefab doesn't contain anything but a game object. So you can think of prefabs as containers now. A prefab is a container, you open the container and you can reveal game objects, prefabs, variants, many things at once, and you can step again into those prefabs and see the content again. And so now I'm seeing that I'm actually at the base level, I see this game object here is the rock. So what I can do is I can scale this rock and save. I turn the autosave off, and of course it's not going to save. But by now you should get the idea. So I can, and then the other interesting thing is that once I'm inside the prefab, I can go here, I have these breadcrumbs, and the breadcrumbs are showing me the path that I took to get to that prefab. So as I'm stepping in and in and in into this chain of hierarchy, if you want, of prefabs, I can go back at any level, whatever, save the change, and I can be back here. Actually, maybe this was not a bug, because you see, the scale of this rock was being overridden here. So let's try to revert that, and then step back into the prefab again. Oops, I have to save, and maybe it's basically better to turn autosave on. And if I scale this rock, now it works. So you see I'm modifying. Calm down. Thank you, though. So you see now I'm modifying the inner prefab, and the change is being propagated to the prefab that's containing it, where this one is nested, and then back to the scene. So I'm able to rotate and whatever you prefer. Well, that's not going to be saved, because rotation is not saved. Anyway, so yeah, these are nested prefabs. Another example I can give you is when you, and we go back to the reusability, right, and on the flexibility concept. I have here this key item, which is called key, and inside it's using this crystal item, which is also, sorry, it's crystal prefab, which is also prefab, which has some particles. If I go back to the scene and I focus my camera like this, you will see here in the back I also have this kind of like pedestal item, the switch, which is also using the same crystal. So I can go in any of these two and go into the crystal, and I want to activate the particles. I don't want to activate them here, because then they would be an override into this prefab. I want to activate them inside the actual prefab. So I go inside the crystal, and finally I find the particles, I activate them, and now you see the particles here in the game view are playing for both the key and the crystal, and the pedestal, because they are both implementing the same prefab, right? So the flexibility is in this use case. It started working again, incredible. So, and this one as well, right? These are all instances of the same prefab. Nesting all clear? Cool. So we move forward to prefab, which is something you haven't seen yesterday, because Nicoline didn't have time. Let's say I have this column. So it's a fine column, I think. It's, of course, a prefab of prefabs. If I step inside, it's made of a bunch of corners. And I used it in several ways in several locations in my temple. So let me focus on this temporarily. So you see it's here, here, and here. But I want to add some variation. So I select this pillar prefab, and what I do is I drag it into the project, and before, Unity will just create like a copy of this prefab. So there's two independent prefabs. But now it gives me a new option. It says, do you want an original prefab, or do you want a prefab variant? And if I say that I want a variant, now that I have now I have a prefab that's kind of inheriting everything the other prefab has, but then it can have variations. So you will notice also that in the hierarchy, this prefab, because it's a variant, it has this icon, which is also in the project, which is like a prefab icon with two diverging arrows. So this is showing me that this is a variant, and in fact, if I select this pillar here in the inspector, I see that it's showing me which one is the base. So I can always trace back the hierarchy of variants, because of course you can have a variant of a variant of a variant. So what can a variant do? Well, let's say that I go to this variant that I just have in the scene. I go inside, and I want to make this a broken pillar. So I collapse the hierarchy again. I open it. I select maybe the top four, and I bring them down, and I bring them to the ground. So now I'm creating these broken variations of the prefab. And you see here, this one is now broken because this is the variant one, while these ones are the base one. But then I can go back into the scene. I can go back into any of my base ones and maybe add some kind of vegetation. So for example, I want to add this hanging moss. So I add the hanging moss. I put it here on the side, not the right side. Oops, this side. This is kind of what the part, what you see is what you get. I'm making these changes, and I'm seeing them here in the game view straight away. So I'm creating this hanging moss, and as you can see, as I create the hanging moss and I move it around, this game object, this prefab, is being added to the base, but also to the variant. But then what I can do is, I can go into the variant, and for example, take this hanging moss and move it down. So let's see if you were following. What has this created on the hanging moss? An override. So this prefab, with respect to the base, now has an override on the position, right? So if I move it into the base, this is not going to move because it's been overridden in the variant. And in fact, if I can select this hanging moss, I can select this one, the base, the root object, and you see here the override drop down. Now it's giving me this information. It's telling me that the base prefab contained into this variant is being overridden on these properties. So the hanging moss is here, the transform is here, and showing me exactly the change that I just made. So this way you have a complete overview of what you're doing and where you're doing it, because this is telling me where this override is living. And actually, you can see here that because this is a prefab inside a prefab and then it has a base, I can decide at which level I want to apply this change. So I can apply this change into the original pillar, the original prefab, or I can apply to the hanging moss itself. So the prefab that's being nested into these two. So you have a lot of power, and as I said before, with this added complexity, we added more visibility, because you need also more overview. With this, with great power, you know the rest. So variants. Oh, and I'll show you one cool trick, actually. I don't know how much time do I have. But one thing that you can do is you can do something like this. You have plants, and you have several types of plants. So let's say I have these 3 types of plants. And these 3 types of plants are basically the same thing. They are an object. Let me step inside this plant. They're a base object that has a mesh collider and a LOD group, and then the LOD group is looking at 3 different meshes of different complexity. So, and each mesh, of course, has its own mesh on the mesh filter. So what you can do is you can actually have some kind of archetype object. For example, this plant is my archetype, and then the other plants, instead of being other prefabs, they're variants. Because they have to do the same things. They will have the same structure. So this plant here is actually a variant of the original plant. It's just overriding the collision mesh, and then the 3, you see here, the 3 meshes on the LOD and the corresponding material. So once these plants are implemented as variants, I'm able to go here to the base and say, let's step inside, let's analyze this. Actually, this plant has a mesh collider that's not convex. That's very bad. I want to make it convex. And you make it convex, and once you go back, all of these are also convex. But that's a smart use of variants, right? If your variations are going to be just exact copies with just a few tweaks on top, then you can make them all variants, and then you have one centralized point where you can control all your similar assets of the same category. So you can kind of create almost like a class of assets, right? And this is cool, I think. Then we have prefab models. So variants come with an added bonus. Have you ever brought a 3D model into Unity, placed some things around, created some collider, and edited those colliders and added some particles, and then you go back into to your modeling package and you want to make some changes to the structure of that 3D model? You save, you go back into Unity, and then those changes are lost because you need to redraw redrag the 3D model to the scene and make a new prefab. So now you have another option. If you go, for example, to these weapons, right? I have the stuff that Helen is using. So let's go back to Helen, and let's pray that this time she will grace us with. So she has the stuff here. And if I step into the prefab, let me focus on her. If I step into the prefab, the stuff for now is just a regular game object because it's not being used anywhere else. So the stuff is here. And you can see that the stuff has some particle system, and the particle system is actually on this game object, which is a child of the object stuff. So again, this is just a regular game object. And I want to do the same thing, but I want to be able to move the particle system in Modo, for example. I use Modo, right? So I want the artist to be able to move the reference object of the particle system. So what do? I take this stuff, and I right-click, create, prefab variant. So just one thing I want to say before this. This is regular Unity, right? You drag a model to the scene, and you get this icon. Do you remember this icon? This is a prefab model. So now this thing is kind of like a prefab, and it's connected to this 3D model. But as soon as I make it a regular prefab, I lose that connection. That's the problem today. But now I can make this prefab, this 3D model into a variant. So I make a variant and I call it stuff. And now, whenever I use this variant, it's going to be connected to my 3D model. So for example, I have the stuff here. I'm going to disable it. I bring in the new model. I want to copy the component, the transform, so it appears exactly in the same place. Then I said I had some particles. Which for some reason are not here. Oh yeah, they're here. So I'm going to just copy the particle system values and add them here. Particles are here again, and I'll delete the original one. So this is now part of the Helen prefab. And the cool thing is now that, for example, these particles are here on this section of the stuff, but if I want to bring them here, my artist, I mean, of course I can do them here in Unity, understand me, but like, if you have a workflow with an artist, then they can double-click, and I should have opened Modo before, as usual. But they can double-click on the, thing and import everything, and then you go into your favorite 3D modeling package, and this works with Modo, with Maya, 3ds Max, whatever modeling package, because it doesn't depend on that. Take the particle element, you move it here to the top, hit Ctrl+S, go back to Unity, and then the particles are there. Because this prefab is a variant of the prefab model, then it inherits all the changes. So as long as you don't override the position of these particles, you're able to do that. And again, you can set up colliders, you can set up particle systems, and all the components that are unique to Unity and that nobody can make into your 3D modeling package. But then you keep that connection. So you can go into the modeling package, move stuff around, rescale, and then everything is sent back into Unity straight away. Whoops. And finally, I want to show you the editing environments. So the editing environments is another new thing that was added to the prefab workflow. And the idea is that maybe you like this thing that when you step inside the prefab, you see nothing around, but maybe you don't. Maybe you want to see that prefab contextualized. You want to see this character against a background or on top of an object. And sometimes you have particle systems that only look good when they are seen against what they're meant to be seen against, right? So we have this thing which is called editing environments, and the idea is that you can assign a scene where you edit your prefabs. So for instance, if I go here into scenes, you will see that I have this thing called editing environment that I can open, and I prepare this scene, which is just basically a cliff with the skybox and stuff, right? It's nothing crazy. You can see here the objects. There's a main camera, but I don't really need it. So there's just this ridge. So I'm going to go back to the example scene so you see what I'm doing. And then you assign this editing environment here. Edit, project settings, editor. Here you have 2 new slots, and you can assign the editing environment here. And now, once I go to any prefab, I'm going to find the dropship again, and I step into prefab mode, I see the dropship in this new environment. You don't see the environment in the hierarchy, right? Because you don't want to modify the environment. You only want to focus on the dropship. So again, like improved focus. But you still see it against the environment, and you're able to check if the colors are right, if the scaling is right, and all of these things that you maybe want to see into like an aseptic environment. And of course, that happens even if you're editing any prefab that's like not in the scene. So for example, this pillar variant, I can double-click, and well, the position is not centered, but you see that it's here. I can actually take this chance to fix the position of this prefab. Right? Go back, and everything is clean. I haven't destroyed anything. You have actually the option to set 2 editing environments. You've seen it before. One for the regular environment and one for the UI. And that's very useful because when it comes to UI, sometimes you have So the concept with this new prefab mode is when you open a UI object in prefab mode, a button, for example, the button needs a canvas to be rendered. And so a canvas will be provided for you in prefab mode, and the button will be automatically parented to that canvas. Maybe the canvas is not the right size, so the button will be huge, right? Because that's meant to be in a smaller panel. And so what the editing environment allows you to do is you can create a UI environment for your UI, assign it here, and then whenever you're editing a UI prefab, you see it contextualized in the proper canvas. Maybe you have a 3D canvas. You can create a scene with a 3D canvas, assign it here, and then all your UI prefabs will open in that. And I think I'm done. So this is it. If you have questions. If you have questions, we still have 14 minutes, not one more. And then the next talk is going to be by Rune and Steen. I don't want to get the names wrong. And they're going to be more in depth about how the system works on the front end, but also on the serialization of the assets and how the prefab is saved and all that stuff. It's very interesting. Please.
Hi, I saw that there are great options to show what is actually overwritten of the base prefab, but is there a way to see which variants derive from a prefab, so that you can see if you have a prefab and you have 5 variants that derive from it?
Not right now.
Not right now. Is it in planning?
Maybe.
I think it would be cool if you have a large project to see who is actually deriving, so you know what you are destroying if you change the base prefab.
Yeah, I know, and this is something that has been asked as well. As usual, it can be sometimes a matter of like how to present this thing in the best possible way. So the inverse, as I showed before, is here. It's very easy, right? Every variant has the base, and then you're able to track back to the base. But how to do the inverse? We need to find the right way to do that.
Okay, thank you.
It's definitely an interesting thing. You're right.
So I love the variant system, but the first thing that comes to mind is there a way, from the code point of view, to know all the variants that exist of these assets? So I can get the list of all the variants, instantiate a random one.
You mean getting all the variants from...
Like I create a bullet prefab, and I create 5 different bullets. And I want to instantiate a random one, and I want my designer to be able to create a 6th one without me knowing, because the code is robust enough. Get all the variants existing and get a random one.
So dynamically loading whatever variant has been created into the project. I don't think so. I think the prefab team is better suited to answer this question. I don't know if they're here, or you can ask them later in the next talk if you're planning to stay. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Sorry.
Hi. I was interested about the scene setting that you showed in the editor settings.
Yeah.
So from my point of view, it doesn't seem like the most logical spot to actually put the setting, because I'm assuming this file is in version control, which means that, for instance, different artists who work on different parts of the game would want to have different backgrounds to use. So is there also a way, for instance, to have them only work locally, like only set the scene locally, or maybe mix it, like setting these prefabs will work with this scene and the other prefabs will work with the other scenes?
Not now. I know that in a first iteration it was explored the possibility of having these settings per prefab, but that was producing exactly the same problem, right? When you set the scene, then you're dirtying the prefab, and then you're producing a change for everybody else. So it was centralized in here to minimize this problem. But I know that the team is working on a better solution, because
I would at least start out with not moving it into the editor settings. But that's...
Where would you want it to be?
A separate file, for instance. You could just have a file that says this is a scene and all the prefabs are listed here, and this is the default version. Something like that, perhaps.
But that would be another setting file, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But at least that's not touched.
So prefab settings, something like that.
Something like that.
Okay. Isn't it the same though?
No,
like you will
because
still
there's
have
other settings here,
no,
so-
but I mean in terms of like version control, because you will still have like a file that you're changing and you don't want to push. And I understand what you're saying. Like you don't want to push your personal preferences, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I know that the team is working on that. Keep in mind that everything you're seeing is version 1 of the prefabs. It's not like they're just moving on, and but they wanted to push out this version as fast as possible to give nesting and variants to the world.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So just as an add-on to that question right now,
Yes.
it probably would also be a good idea to have all of your, you could tag your scenes as prefab scenes and then have a drop-down in the prefab editor itself, because that switchover would be fast for everyone. Like just in the prefab editor, have a drop-down to quickly switch the background I want to use right now, instead of having to go through all the preferences and change it there.
So you mean something like here I would have something to select the scene that I want to see them into.
Exactly, yeah. And then some way to tag the scenes or list the scenes.
Sure, but I mean, sure, it's a good idea. It's a cool idea. I'm just thinking of the scenario where you're editing like 200 rocks, and every time you're like switching and switching and switching.
Well, just remember the last one. But my question is different, but it might be that it will delay to the next talk anyway. Since for UI, it's absolutely amazing that we have this now. But UI is often generative, so that I select the prefab as a configuration in the parent prefab value, for example, for a list. So when I do a variant of a list with a different generated item prefab selected, is there something like a slot system? We can say, okay, this is a slot for a prefab that is not already instanced, so I can like nest the prefab, but override what prefab is nested in there.
I didn't get it.
Do you get the idea? So I have the prefab A, and nested inside is B, but this B is overridable, so I can say, okay, I still have prefab A, but then instead of nesting B inside, I want to have prefab C nested inside at the same position with the same transform.
One thing, I don't know if he answers your question, but I'm going to show you one thing that maybe does. One thing that you cannot do is, for example, if I look at this pillar, I didn't save the scene, so the variant, right? If I look at the variant, one thing you cannot do is you can't delete an object that comes from the base, right? So this is a variant, which is this prefab that comes from a base. If the object is here, you cannot delete it in here.
Okay.
What you can do is you can disable it, and that will be, of course, an override. So I've disabled this object. So that's one limitation, but that comes because if you were able to delete stuff, then later on in the chain, there might be that thing again, and that creates a lot of confusion. So one limitation that the team has decided to impose is to not allow people to delete prefabs that are delete objects inside prefabs that are inheriting from another prefab.
Yeah, okay.
Is that what you were trying to do?
Not really,
because
it kind of feels like a soft no. So
okay, because one thing you can do is you can add things, right? If I were to add something to this prefab, I will see it here as an override, but you can't delete. So you can add to variants, but you can't delete what was in the previous one.
Okay, so there is no option where you can say, okay, use this property, for example, as a property which links to a prefab as a value to spawn this prefab automatically inside another. I don't know. I might just ask you.
If it's a property, you can override it for sure.
No, because the property is just used. Okay, maybe we just have to do it via coding then, by scripting, so that the prefab automatically gets updated whenever you change the properties, which just opens a lot of new questions for me. So I will just ask them later.
You need to explain me this problem offline, I think. So grab me later, and we can chat.
Cool. Hi.
Hi.
I probably shouldn't say that it was about time for this, but it was about time for this.
Okay.
No, seriously.
You're right.
I think you created an extremely powerful tool that will help improve the workflow, especially with models, extremely well. So I guess I speak for everyone when I say thanks to this team for this feature.
You can thank the team in the next talk in like 10 minutes. There's one person there.
I'm happy to try it out pretty soon. So
cool.
Thanks.
Hi. Did you tackle the circular dependencies? So if prefab A is nested in B in C and C in A? Or
yeah,
recursive?
it's not allowed, basically. So if I go back to my rocks here, and I go into the line of rocks, and sorry, I want to select the prefab in the assets. So if I go to the rock, and I go into the line of rock, and then I go into this one, then I shouldn't be able to, yeah. So it's, where are you? Ah, okay. I was like, wow, that was a short fuse. Yeah. So it's not allowed. So it gives you a warning, and it doesn't allow you. Because, yeah, that wouldn't make sense. Yeah. If nobody has extra questions, then I think I can end. Do you want to see something more? Yes. Okay, we still have 5 minutes, I think. So I'm going to show you another possibility with this new system. And I want to reiterate what I said before, that prefabs now are, you need to think of them as containers that can contain something else, that can contain something else, that could be the variation of something else, and that thing could also contain something else. So you want to open this, and every time you dig and you see the contents. And that's the reason why in a prefab, you see now that the base is actually a game object. It looks counterintuitive, maybe, but it makes a lot of sense. It's showing you that this is like not a prefab. What you can do then with this new system is you can take, for example, this small rocks line, right-click, and you have this thing, unpack prefab. And so if you think of what I just said, it's the concept of like opening this box and revealing what's inside. So if this is a prefab that contains prefabs, if I unpack, I see a game object that contains prefabs. And the other option I'm going to undo is unpack prefab completely. And this like digs through the hierarchy of dependencies, and it just unpacks everything. And so if I unpack a prefab completely, they all become game objects, right? Which is useful? I don't know. It can be useful, right? It could be useful if, for example, you want to get this item that's not actually a prefab, so you don't want to leave like overrides here and there. So this is another possibility. And I don't want to spoil, because I think Rune is going to talk about this stuff later. So last question.
Hey, so since you can unfold nested prefabs in prefabs, right?
Yeah.
You can change properties on game objects in nested prefabs. Is this then saved in the nested prefab, or in this prefab you're currently editing?
You mean when I unpack?
No, not unpacking, but the small rock 01 that you have there. If you click that and modify something on that game object, where
here,
is it?
in the scene.
Yes, or any of the component properties.
Yeah, it's in the scene.
No, sorry. Edit this prefab, the small rock line.
Just a second. Revert. So this one.
Yes, go on the prefab editor.
Okay.
And then you can unfold this, right? Oh no, then I'm mistaking. I'm sorry.
What do you mean, unpack?
I thought you could like unfold this now and look into the childs of this prefab.
I can go in.
Yeah, okay, no, I'm mistaking, I'm sorry.
No, because, look, for example, this rock here is just a game object, right? So if I look inside, I see the game object. If I look from the outside, I see the prefab. So it's like closing the box, but it's showing me exactly the same stuff. If this rock had a child, so if I go inside and I add whatever, a cube, good old cube. If I add the cube, then once I go back, I see the cube in the parent prefab, right? So everything is the same. It's just that from the outside, this looks like a prefab. From the inside, I see the contents. I see the game object. I see the pure matter. So I'm able to delete the cube, step back, step back. Very last question.
Yep. Do we have an horizontal scroll bar in the hierarchy now, since you like explode everything when you go in prefabs?
No.
When you get very deep nesting, you can't actually read your names.
You mean this one?
No, in the hierarchy view. So if you get like 5 or 6 level of nesting, then there's no like horizontal bar.
No, there's no horizontal bar. But I'll teach you a trick. If you hold the Alt button and you click on a hierarchy, it will collapse or explode the whole hierarchy.
Yep, but I still can't read it.
I know. You need to like
expand the hierarchy. So.
Sure. You need to like expand the hierarchy window if you want. I know. Yes. Okay. So this was it. Now, again, Rune and Steen are going to go into a deep technical dive into the prefab system, if you want to stay. This is all from me. Thank you.